Hello, my name is Caitlin McNichol, and I have with me Ashwarya Manmadden. And today we are going to do a presentation on the research paper written by Peng, Li, Xu, and Su on CEO duality, organizational slack, and firm performance in China. Before we begin talking about the research paper, we'd like to give an overview of what we will be covering in this presentation. So first, we will define CEO duality and organizational slack. We will then cover the research done in this area previously and discuss how CEO duality and organizational slack can impact firm performance. We will then move to discuss the research methods, analysis, and findings of this paper. We'll then take this research and look about how the findings in this paper can be considered in a Canadian business context by looking at a number of publicly and privately traded businesses in Canada. And then we will conclude on our findings. So to begin, like I mentioned, we want to define a couple of key concepts that are discussed in this paper. The first of which is CEO duality, which is where a single person serves as both the CEO and board chair of a company. The second is organizational slack, and this refers to the resources that the company has available more than what is required to meet its immediate operational and business needs. Organizational slack can be broken down into, firstly, absorbed slack, such as underutilized capacity, and secondly, unabsorbed slack, such as currently uncommitted cash flows and untapped lines of credit. Unabsorbed slack is more flexible and deployable for other business purposes due to the ability of the CEO to make decisions regarding the use of unabsorbed slack. It will be the focus of the discussion in this presentation today. This paper explains and compares the effect of CEO duality and organizational slack in two different types of companies, state-owned enterprises and private-owned enterprises. Research completed in this field to date by Tian Lao and Peng, Zhang and Li have shown that CEO duality is positively correlated with firm performance. Further, research by Tian and Peng has shown that organizational slack contributes to firm performance. Finally, research has been completed looking at ownership types and firm performance by Peng, Tan, and Tong. The objective of this paper is to look at these relationships more iteratively and to answer the question, how does CEO duality and organizational slack affect the performance of firms with different ownership types? I'd now like to pass it over to Ashwarya to talk about the hypothesis of the paper.
Thank you, Caitlin. The first hypothesis in this paper is the level of organizational slack is positively related to firm performance. The reason for this is that organizational slack, specifically unabsorbed slack, is potentially usable resources that can be redeployed to achieve a firm's goals. As the CEO would be involved in the decision making of how the slack is used, CEO duality or non-duality could have an impact on organizational slack and firm performance. In Peng, Li, Ji, and Su's paper, they argue that there is a positive relationship between unabsorbed slack and firm performance for the following reasons. 1. Chinese firms often face very competitive markets and needs to develop new products quickly. 2. China's fast-changing environment requires regular strategic changes. 3. Many Chinese firms face a shortage of financial resources. The second hypothesis in this paper states CEO duality reduces the positive relationship between organizational slack and firm performance in China's state-owned enterprises. As mentioned previously, the CEO has input on how organizational slack is used by a company. While having a CEO duality can reduce a conflict and increase the speed of decision making in state-owned enterprises, the paper argues that there are significant agency problems in China. Therefore, it is likely that CEOs would use this organizational slack for personal purposes, and the hypothesis by Peng, Li, Ji, and Su that in state-owned enterprises, CEO duality is not beneficial to firm performance. The third and final hypothesis is CEO duality enhances the positive relationship between organizational slack and firm performance in China's privately owned enterprises. The reason for CEO duality increasing firm performance is due to the unlikelihood that the company's resources would have used in a way that would be detrimental to the company due to the CEO's interest as an owner in the company succeeding. There is also a further benefit that the company will be able to make more timely decisions by having the CEO and chairman as the same person. Coming to the method of study, the data used for this research is from 2004 and 2005, since there has been a tremendous change taken place in China in the last decade. A sample of 300 firms, including 163 state owned enterprises and 137 privately owned enterprises, is taken from China's stock market accounting database, which consists of the publicly held companies trading on Shanghai and Shenzhen stock exchanges. This is one of the most influential financial databases in China. The sample data has been compared with other firms in the database in the aspect of attributes such as firm size, age, and sales using t-tests to avoid any kind of error. All the t-tests were insignificant, resulting in little to no sampling error. As mentioned earlier, unabsorbed slack is calculated by dividing the total debt by total assets, hence we focus on unabsorbed slack in this study. Current assets provide managers a great freedom to use it on alternate sources because it is highly deployable. Hence, dividing by total assets to remove any effects on firm size. A firm with high debt ratio will have limited ability to raise additional cash through incurring debt. Therefore, inverse debt ratio is also used to measure unabsorbed slack. The loadings of both items are 0.961 higher than the permitted 0.7, while the reliability coefficient of unabsorbed slack is 0.908 higher than the recommended 0.7. Peng in 2007 coded firms with CEOs serving also as the chair as 1 and other firms as 0. The paper follows Tan and Peng because there is a time lag in the influence of organizational slack in firm performance. Hence, CEO duality and organizational slack from 2004 data is compared with other variables from the data obtained in 2005. Analysis of study. There are 7 control variables measured in this paper. They are 1. Firm size, 2. Firm age, 3. Environmental munificence, 4. Environmental dynamism, 5. Outside directors, 6. CEO ownership, and 7. Industry. Firm size and age are taken as standard control variables. The addition of environmental munificence and dynamism requires some explanation. The work by Peng explains that for businesses located in low munificence and high dynamism environments, CO duality is advantageous. Places like Beijing and Shanghai are considered as high munificence environments because these provinces are coastal and coastal regions have substantial managerial, technological, and governance resources. Non-coastal areas, on the other hand, are considered as low munificence environment. A standardized measure of the volatility of industry sales growth over a 5-year period operationalizes environmental dynamism. The other control are called outside directors, which is studied with CEO duality in corporate governance, and the impact of it is still weak. Tian and Lau report says that there is no significant relationship between outside directors and firm performance, whereas Peng says outside directors have little impact on the return of assets and a positive effect on sales growth. CEO ownership is at a low level in China, about 0.045% of the firm's equity. Thus, we will have to wait to see if it affects the firm performance. Hence, it is measured using a dummy variable. Finally, the industries are controlled by dummy variables. And in this table shown here, variance inflation factor is calculated. The cutoff for value for variance inflation factor is 10, and in here the value for majority are below 2, suggesting little multicollinearity in the data. In this table 2 shows the findings for 3 samples, which are 1, the combined, 2, state-owned enterprises, and 3, privately owned enterprises. For the combined sample, Model 2 report significant positive relationship between organizational slack and firm performances, which support hypothesis 1. Model 4 and 7 test hypothesis 1 for state-owned enterprises and privately owned enterprises samples, and the result ends up supporting the hypothesis. To reduce the risk of multicollinearity in equations, the relevant variables in Model 5 and 8 are mean-centered when the moderating components of CEO duality are added. Model 5 indicates that there is a negative moderating effect on CEO duality in state-owned enterprises, supporting hypothesis 2. Further, CEO duality has a positive moderating effect in privately owned enterprises that supports hypothesis 3. Discussions. There are 2 contributions according to the paper: theoretical and empirical emerge. First, theoretically, in contrast to most studies described earlier, that the focus on the immediate effects of the sample integrates the effects of CEO duality, organizational slack, and ownership types on the business performance. This framework contributes to the advancement of China's strategy research by tackling a challenging, significant, and unresearched issue. There was not one more study conducted to whether CEO duality is good or bad. Instead, the paper supported China's institutional changes, a contingent perspective concentrating on ownership effects. Second, they have conducted a meticulous replication with extension of the empirical research. The findings show 1, a positive relationship between organizational slack and firm performance; 2, CEO duality positively impacts in privately owned enterprises and negatively in state-owned enterprises. By utilizing more recent data and demonstrating a beneficial effect of organizational slack on firm performance, the paper also replicate, extend, and essentially support Tan and Peng's findings in 2003. Overall, the strategy area needs additional replications with extensions to advance because research is a cumulative endeavor by Sang and Kwang in 1999. In strategy research, there are sadly no many replications. Thus, the study adds to the body of literature by demonstrating how to advance past research by careful replication and extension. Additionally, other studies by Peng in 2004, 2007, and 2003 duplicated US findings using data from China and went a step further by combining Yu and Zhao's study with fresh data in 2009. The result demonstrates that organizational slack and firm performance are strongly correlated, and the CEO duality moderates this link negatively in state-owned enterprises but favorably in privately owned enterprises. Organizational slack is not necessarily bad. CEO duality may be appropriate in privately owned enterprises but inappropriate in state-owned enterprises. To conclude, avoid giving general recommendations about whether CEO duality is beneficial or harmful for business performances.
Thanks, Aishwarya. Now we'd like to move over to the Canadian context of this study. So first, starting off with CEO duality in Canada. So the research paper completed by Peng et al. Shows that state-owned enterprises do not have a positive correlation with slack if they are... Thanks, Aishwarya. So now we'd like to move over to the Canadian context, first of all looking at CEO duality in Canada. So the paper takes a look at state-owned enterprises as well as private-owned enterprises. So starting off with state-owned, or as they're known in Canada, crown corporations, to see if there were any situations where we could see CEO duality. So a review of 5 federally owned Crown corporations showed non-duality, so the chairman and CEO were different people, and a review of 5 provincially owned Crown corporations further showed non-duality, so a separate board chair and CEO as well. So we then focused our review on privately owned corporations in Canada, so whether this is privately owned, not traded on the stock market, or privately owned and traded on the stock market. So we did a review of 10 publicly traded companies in Canada, which showed 3 with CEO duality and 7 with a separate CEO and chairman, and further did a review of a privately owned company in Canada, and also that showed CEO duality as well. So moving on to unabsorbed slack in Canadian companies, we reviewed the 10 publicly traded companies in Canada for the factors of unabsorbed slack reviewed by Peng, Li, Shi, and Zhu. So looking at the financial information available on these companies' websites, we looked at the current assets available for use, being current assets less current liabilities, and divided by total assets to remove the impact of company size for comparability. In this instance, we were looking for a higher percentage of current assets available for CEOs to be able to deploy to improve company performance. For the debt asset ratio, we were looking to show the ability of the company to obtain additional financing, which they would be able to be deployed for other uses by the CEO, and in this instance, looking for a lower percentage, as highly leveraged companies will be challenged to obtain additional financing to use to improve companies' performance. The results show that companies with CEO duality perform better in both categories than those without, as seen on the graph here. So current assets available for use was 27.3% for companies with CEO duality and 15% with those with non-duality. The debt asset ratio was 43.4% for companies with CEO duality and 58.2% for those with a separate CEO and board chair. And again, we're looking for a lower ratio there. These results support hypothesis 3 that CEO duality enhances the relationship between organizational slack and firm performance, not only in the Chinese market, but in the Canadian market for private companies. Lastly, we want to look at one privately owned company in Canada, being a well-known company, the Jim Pattison Group. The Jim Pattison Group started as one car dealership in 1961 and has since expanded to a conglomerate of businesses operating mainly across Canada and the US. So some of their operations include car dealerships, Canfor, Ripley's Believe It or Not, as well as some businesses familiar to Kamloops, such as Save On Foods and Nature's Fair, which are both a part of the Pattison Food Group, and Pattison Media, which is headquartered in Kamloops. Pattison Media includes the TV station CFJC, as well as the 2 Kamloops radio stations, B100 and 98.3 CIFM. So looking at Jim Pattison Group in the context of CEO duality and organizational slack, Jim Pattison Group has CEO duality as the CEO and board chairman is Jimmy Pattison. The company has seen significant growth and success since operations began in 1961, which can be seen with the consistent sales growth on the graph shown. As the group is privately held, other financial information is not accessible. However, due to continued expansion and growth, this privately held Canadian business further supports that CEO duality enhances the relationship between organizational slack and firm performance. To conclude, Peng, Li, Shiu's, and Su's paper concludes that there's a positive relationship between organizational slack and performance. CEO duality negatively impacts this relationship in state-owned enterprises. CEO duality positively impacts this relationship in private-owned enterprises. In Canadian businesses, we noted a positive relationship with CEO duality and unabsorbed slack for publicly traded and private companies. Therefore, we would recommend this be a consideration when a privately owned or publicly traded Canadian company is determining if they would like a separate CEO and board chair or to have CEO duality. Thank you.